Welcome, everybody, to Navigating Change, the podcast from Tybal Inc. I'm Pete Wright. That's Howard Tybal.
Hello, Pete.
Hello, Howard.
My kids love that, too. Hello, Pete.
Oh, it takes me back. It takes me to the early, the halcyon days of podcasting. Yes. We're sort of wrapping up spring break season around the country here, and we've decided to take on a really simple topic today.
Only I know your sarcasm. You're flagging your sarcasm.
I'm flagging it. I am hanging a flag on it. This is a tough one. This is we're sort of doing a response or a spin-off of an article by Mark Kierleber in the Chronicle of Higher Education that went live on March 24th, just a couple of days ago as we record this. And the article was titled, "Financially Strapped Colleges Grow More Vulnerable as Economic Recovery Lags." It takes on, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, or make it more dramatic than it needs to be, but there is a real sort of bloodletting going on across particularly smaller institutions. And, as you and I have been talking about this article, it seemed like it might be worth digging into some of these bigger issues, as you are in the thick of it. You are working with these kinds of institutions to help define strategic direction. So that's really our theme today. You share some opening thoughts, will you?
Well, I'll tell you what. When I read this, there wasn't it's about time. But I got to tell you, this is a wake up call. And I think that's what this article is doing and should do for trustees, for heads of schools, especially small schools, even schools that are doing well in their enrollment in this upcoming next season, and they got a decent endowment. This should be a wake-up call to the fact that what's coming is having to make tougher decisions, and this is something higher ed has historically been not very good at, and it's around the workforce.
Why have they been not good at that?
Because, if you go way back, and I think that this mentality still is there, is that there's sort of been an implicit promise that if you join a college university, you have a job for life. And I think people in the corporate space learned that a number of years ago, that promise was no longer there. And then people became acclimated to the realities around that. I think higher ed is just beginning to come to terms with that it is acceptable if we're leading these institutions and we're really talking about financial sustainability, we have to look at our people. And this article, which this is the first time I've seen the kind of clear description of examples around layoffs at several schools, even saying the word layoffs. I can't tell you how many meetings I'm in with senior leadership, and there are euphemisms for everything, especially for this concept of layoffs. Now, there's a way of doing it, and the schools that do this well, meaning they right-size their workforce, basically bringing their expenses in line with their revenue. The schools that do this well recognize that there's three basic categories of quote-unquote layoffs. One is the idea that they're not going to fill vacancies. There's a lot of vacancies in institutions where not filling that or saying we're not going to fill that, that's the equivalent of taking away that position from a department and save some money. Right. The second way, which is also somewhat compassionate, is considering early retirements, and these have been more predominant since 2008. And the third way is actual layoffs, saying to somebody, listen, your position is no longer necessary given how we're trying to restructure ourselves. It is an important thing that institutions look at. Every time I get up in front of a group, Pete, and I say, the one area that is the greatest expense is your salary, comp, and benefits, every single leader is nodding their heads going, yeah, and we don't know how to have that conversation.
What does that mean, they don't know how to have that conversation? Is it simply that because they haven't historically, because getting a job with a university, tends to be like getting a job with the government, or was in the 80s? You just be there for life. They've never had the opportunity to practice it, or that there's an expectation of employees that they're safe, and they just, there's more sort of sensitivity.
Yeah, and I think that there's a strong sense of loyalty, especially loyalty in the academic side. So if you're an administrator who works for a faculty member, I've seen numerous times where faculty will come to administrators' defense in the face of considering some type of restructuring, and how important it is these people or this person is to my organization. And that sense of loyalty is very positive, but also over time, it's something that institutions or the leaders have to be willing to say, this is why we're doing this. This gets back to that whole conversation I've been talking about now for a number of years, which is really being able to describe the brutal facts of what we're dealing with as an institution and have a vision for the future. Part of what this article speaks to is the fact that it suggests that it's focusing specifically on short-term issues and not really looking at long-term. What I have seen great institutions doing, and we're working with some of them right now, and they are doing both. They are right-sizing their operating budgets for the next 3 years. They're saying we have to get in front of this by looking at our structure, but we're going to step back and say, through a reconstituted strategic plan, this is where we're trying to go in the next 10 to 20 years. Now, maybe 20 is too far, but 10 years, this is where we want to be. And those messages have to be there. A positive view of the future for those who are remaining, as well as a story about this is what we're tackling and this is why we have to do these things. Some schools I'm working with right now have never laid off one employee in their entire tenure, at least the people I've worked with. And so part of it, Pete, is a practice, is developing a discipline that they can do this and they won't have a riot on campus. I mean, there's a fear about what the reaction will be, and most of the time the reaction.
I think it's terrific that you brought up this concept of loyalty. I have received feedback from one administrator on this issue when discussing layoffs, that there is this sense of, we want to create an institution, cultivate a culture in our institution that, in which employees don't have to come to work and, fear that they're not justifying their jobs in the way that they should, that they're at risk somehow. And we have a culture in higher ed that we don't do that. And that's not something that we touch on because we're different. We don't want to be considered that sort of a race. And
I was thinking, too, that part of what's going on in the administrative side of the house, the non-academic areas, is that, if you think about tenure is a freedom that gives freedom from protecting the academic faculty member so that they can speak their mind. On the administrative side, there's this implicit kind of tenure. Once you get a job here, you will, you're not necessarily set for life, but you don't have to really worry about it. And like you said, we want to create a safe environment for people to feel that their jobs are not at risk. The other thing that I'm seeing more and more of, because when we get asked to do projects, whether it's some kind of institutional review that helps them look for revenue or cost savings, benchmarking, is that nobody wants to go first. So the problem right now is if an institution doesn't it wants to consider, for example, stopping football.
Oh,
right? They're not going to. But let's say there's real momentum for them to not do football. They need evidence that there are schools that are their peer institutions that are doing the same thing. It's like nobody wants to be the first one, because the risk if you're the first one is you will, in a sense, you become in the spotlight. I mean, part of the thing that is, no school in a sense wants to be in the paper unless it's good news, and you do something that risks being put in the news and gets characterized in any kind of negative way, you risk the perception that your school's in trouble. So I think that there is this overcautiousness that is going to shift as more and more schools find themselves making and doing tough decisions. I think that we're at the beginning stages of tougher decisions happening, especially at the smaller colleges that are regionally serve students in their area, are not the Ivies, but charge a very high tuition and have to step back and go, all right, we have to make some tough decisions. And unfortunately, that lives in a particular domain, and it's around the workforce. And there's no getting around that. And yet you can close academic programs, you can change your business model and say, we're going to focus on this and not that. But ultimately, schools have avoided for too long looking at that they have the right workforce for the institution that they have. No one would argue with that, but nobody wants to talk about it.
Well, it's such an interesting thing to talk about, I think, too. And much of it is because it's positioned so negatively across the industry. What we have now come to understand on the corporate side of the house is that we have to restructure because the needs of the business change over time, right?
Right.
That there is a sense of, if we're going to go down that road of having the right people in the right roles at the right time, and as the business needs change, as the market changes, and in higher ed, as program needs change, requirements change, as demand fluctuates, it has not heretofore been an accepted practice to change workforce in light of the changing market, because
they haven't had the flexibility. They haven't given themselves the flexibility, like in the corporate sector, to be able to pull all the appropriate levers to keep themselves financially viable. And everything's been focused around dealing with an operating budget gap. It happens every year. This is not new territory. The schools are in many cases, a very similar place they've been in for the last 20 years. The difference is there's a spotlight on it, and there's more pressure. The public pressure is also changing the dynamic, in that there's a greater sense of ownership of parents. Think about when all of a sudden you discover that you had the capacity to find out exactly what your car cost.
Oh.
And understand what the sticker price really means.
Right.
Families are more empowered now than ever to be able to understand the needs, what a school's actually charging, and how to get the data. And as a result, and the pressures now of tuition not being able to be raised the way they could in the past. And I think those pressures are causing schools to relook at more seriously their business model. But again, my premise has been for a long time, until some predominant schools that have the appearance of being financially, solvent, everything's good, that they either have to close a big part of their program, or they close their doors, or they have to merge. When that starts to happen a couple times, more and more schools are going to jump on the bandwagon to say, see, this institution in the town over, they have done this. We now can take this step too. And unfortunately, that is it falls into a leadership conversation.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. You in your work, as you're working on, doing these institutional reviews and benchmarking projects, you're working to help these institutions find define a strategic direction, as you already said. Looking 10, if not 20 years out, by way of financial sustainability. And I say that because it seems so important. In projects like this, when we see this data, how do you know you're responding in a way that is thinking longer term when you're dealing with these human resources issues, and not responding to a short-term thinking or a symptom?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that schools have become very accustomed to dealing with symptoms. It's a decision-making challenge. I think that, as we do more and more work around helping senior teams make better decisions, I think we're discovering more and more of what they're responding to are the external symptoms. And that's a good foray into the conversation. But at some point, you've got to step back and go, what does it mean? What changes should we be putting in place? And I think the truth is, at this point, we're still, as an industry, and even external, suppliers and resources, we're still trying to understand the problem. I would speculate that we're still not in a place where anybody really has, even for the different kinds of higher eds that are out there and answer. We're still trying to understand the problem. And there's a lot of pontificating, there's a lot of writing going on, but I think we're getting there. I think we're getting closer to schools understanding that they have to deal both with the short term and have a long-term strategy. The difficulty in higher ed is it's such a decentralized community, and there's so many different kinds of stakeholders that the key is going to be getting all the people who need to be part of this at the table together to solve the problem. That does not happen enough.
This comes back to this issue of the importance of the senior leadership team, the management team in the university, and the impact that they have.
And by the way, when you say senior leadership team, I want to be clear. We're talking about senior academic folks as well as senior administrative folks. You know, there's the business side of higher education, and then there's what it's really serving, which is the teaching and the research. And it is a misconception to think when you say senior management, anybody listening to this, that senior management is not talking about the academic side of the house, because it does. The academic side of the house, in some cases, need to decide if they want to participate deeply in this conversation.
Absolutely, and you can, I would just highlight some of the podcasts we've done recently on reaching across the aisle and the CAO-CBO relationship, and
That's
just
right.
how important that is. But I wonder if you could comment a little bit on this, on the relationship that these roles have in defining an institution's agility in the education market.
Well, you mean the roles on the management side of the house? So we know whether it's enrollment management and, student affairs and auxiliary functions and facilities.
I'm getting more to the issue of having the institution-wide responsiveness to market changes, right? Because this is one of the things we don't see, and I've talked before about my own alma mater, which had an issue with one of the programs, my program, and they closed it. They essentially burned the program to the ground in order to start something new. So they brought in all new leadership for this academic program, a new, director of the program, new faculty, and called it something slightly different. But essentially, this was their way, not knowing any other way to make an easy transition into this new world, because the field has changed. This was their way to say, we need to try something dramatically different, and we need to do it fast. So we're going to be agile in this area. We're going to take 2 years, burn the old thing to the ground, and start something new as quickly as we can possibly do it. To me, that is as burned as I felt at the time, knowing that 25 years ago, I had this fantastic degree. I see that as really a signal to one way that academic programs can respond to the changing market. Students aren't going for this. We need to change the way we think about what we offer. Because,
I'll tell you, if you could have been a fly on the wall, what you would have seen there is a leader or a set of leaders who were on the same page or found a way to be on the same page. And I'll tell you, you look at 5 different institutions, you have 5 different ways that leadership body comes together to make decisions. Sometimes the president is an observer and a listener and taking input from his vice presidents. Other times the vice presidents are waiting for the president because the president's the one who is front and center and has to be in everything. It is so specific to that institution's leadership model, and having the right people in there who are ready and willing to work together. In your situation there, that to me is an unusual circumstance where they decide, you know what, we are going to be dramatic here. We're going to do something that is going to allow us to look at this fresh and clean. And I'll tell you, most schools and most leaders are not willing to do it. It's too risky for them to do something that could be perceived either from a set of faculty, the board members, the media. There's always somebody who's not going to like it. And that's why, my experience more and more is leaders have to have a backbone and be willing to risk that maybe they're going to fail, or maybe they're going to do something that's right for the institution. But you know what? There's no guarantee that they're going to be left standing. I mean, that to me is a sign of a true leader, and that's not an easy. You got to have a certain kind of backbone to be willing to make tough decisions and potentially risk your job.
Well, that's exactly what I'm getting at. Like the whole idea of being able to take those sorts of risks, as you say, it's not usual, but isn't that what we're striving for?
Yeah, and there's a lot of, and I think in the bell-shaped curve of people that are ahead of the curve and people that are slightly behind and people that are laggards. Just, I think that what's playing out here is what plays out in different industries. Is that there are going to be those who are going to risk and succeed, those who are going to risk and fail, and then there's going to be the majority who are going to look to see at the carnage and say, all right, what did they do right? What did they do wrong? Here's a calculated thing for us to do. I think, though, we're all sitting in this really ambiguous place where it is really unclear how this is going to shake out. I think that the prevailing wisdom is the elite schools, and we can have different definitions of what those are, they will find a way through this because there's a presumption that if you get a degree from an elite school, you will have the right kind of, it's not like Harvard has a better graduate school of education degree program, but it's Harvard, and it's Yale, and whatever those elite schools are that you put on the category, those schools will continue to have a sufficient enrollment and be able to charge what they want to charge to get students through their programs. The majority of schools, though, are going to have to figure out what their brand is and get refined around that. We're trying to do something very difficult, Pete. We're trying to undo years of offering more and more and more so that maybe we'll attract a wider base. And schools now have programs that are no longer viable. So, but uncoupling a program is tied to faculty who teach in other areas too. So that's what makes this particularly hard. The schools that are dealing with this now, they're the ones that actually are getting the data about their programs, and they are putting it in front of leadership and faculty and saying, we have to make some changes here.
So you are sending this wonderful piece by Mr. Kierleber to some of your clients, and I'm wondering how you are positioning this. You're sending an email to your clients at school saying, hey, you need to read this. Why?
That's interesting. I am sending this article out to, and my guess is a lot of them saw the title or read the title and they know what this is. This article is a reminder that it's only continuing, but I also think the article is a reminder for leadership that it's important to get behind closed doors and have the workforce conversation. I think this is an empowering article in one way, in that it does show that schools are looking at, some of these small schools, they're looking at their workforce and they're making some tough decisions about, having to, in some cases, lay people off. And I think that kind of evidence is important for schools to see, because many of them don't feel like they can have that conversation. When you see other schools doing it, I think it empowers you to say, maybe we should be looking at that.
It is a fascinating look at the changes that continue to plague higher education, and as these smaller schools try to right their direction. And it really is an interesting article. We'll put it in the show notes at TibleLink.com with the notes for this episode.
And I also just want to end by saying, Pete, I'm optimistic about the future. There's the danger with articles like this is it paints a negative and dire view. This is not about a dire view. This is about how do we sustain the institutions so they can grow in the right direction. And I'll tell you that the schools that are having these conversations are going to be okay for the most part, but they have to be willing to have the conversations at the most senior level and put everything on the table. Whatever we call those elephants in the room, they need to talk about those. And there's not that many levers. Workforce is one of the biggest levers. and it's now coming out. So I think that's a positive sign.
I'm glad you said that. I mean, we talk so often about tuition adjustment, financial aid adjustment as the big levers, for what we can do to handle the revenue side. But talking about programmatic adjustment and workforce adjustment, this is new accommodation to the financial sustainability discussion.
I agree.
Powerful. So if you want to find out more about this show and what Howard and I are talking about and our growing catalog of fantastic guests, head over to TeibelInc.com and you can find out all you need to know about the Navigating Change podcast. You can search for us in the iTunes podcast directory, by far the largest podcast directory, and it's a great way to subscribe for free. Make sure you don't miss a single episode of Navigating Change. I think that's it. Do we have any other announcements for the people, Howard?
Not that I can think of, Pete.
I love it. On behalf of Howard Teibel, I'm Pete Wright. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week on Navigating Change, the podcast from Teibel Inc.